What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. A lot of people definitely know about all the crazy stuff that happened around the alpha and beta of Hearthstone, like the old super overpowered versions of the cards, maybe the old ranking system and stuff like that. I mean, you would definitely know if you watch our videos, that's for sure. We definitely do like to make a lot of videos on that kind of stuff, but as well, not a lot of people, and something that we definitely enjoy talking about is the stuff that happened before the alpha and the beta, way in the early days when the devs were testing out all sorts of crazy stuff in Hearthstone. And today we're going to be taking a look at some of the information of the design as well as the development process for Hearthstone, and what that information could have meant to Hearthstone if some of the early designs and mechanics had remained the same. And we're jumping back before the release of the alpha, so as far back as you could possibly go, to take a trip back and find out what Hearthstone could have been. Now, a lot of the cards and mechanics that ended up getting removed from Hearthstone in general were mostly, removed due to fun or maybe balance reasons before any public information was released about the game. For example, we know that some of the original ideas for possible mechanics on cards did things like make your opponent discard cards or perhaps destroy your opponent's mana crystals. Now, Blizzard scrapped all of the ideas of these cards and those like it, and have said several times that they pretty much never plan on putting them in the entire game, ever, since they really don't like cards that make things not fun for the opponent. But let's explore some of the potential designs that Hearthstone could have had as far as these mechanics go. So starting with the discard idea, in other card games that are potentially similar to Hearthstone, there's generally like 3 types of discard mechanics. There's one where the opponent chooses what you discard, there's one where you choose what you discard, and then of course discarding cards at random. Now, choosing what you discard is obviously going to be the best for you, and might not necessarily hurt Hearthstone too much as long as the cards were reasonably balanced. Your opponent uses a card in exchange for you discarding what would be probably the worst card in your hand, and this works potentially similar to draw spells in that it maybe gives your opponent card advantage over you. Obviously, it's not necessarily that fun of a mechanic, definitely not as fun as drawing cards since it's pretty much a negative effect. Overall, this version of a discard mechanic wouldn't actually necessarily be that bad for the game though, but the other 2 types of discard effects would absolutely be super problematic. I mean, your opponent choosing what card to take from your hand but possibly has a fair amount of strategic depth, but is super bad for the game and definitely would be very anti-fun. In Hearthstone, you're only allowed to play one of certain legendary cards, so if your opponent discards your Reno Jackson or your Alex Strasza or something, you're just screwed. And this is even worse for combo decks, and discarding a random card has a very similar effect, because what happens if you just randomly discard the worst card? And there's a lot of decks where if you end up losing one of your combo pieces or one of your key things, you just can't win, and there's no way to play around those types of discard effects if they're on like a spell or a battle cry or a death rattle or something like that. Cards like this would definitely change the game for the worse and would pretty much make everything that's not a mid-range or aggro deck a lot less playable. Now, random discards would probably have a very similar effect and just be super weird and not that, fun to play with. And I have to say, it's definitely for the best that Blizzard decided not to implement this mechanic into the game. Discarding cards from your hand is something that just feels so lame when it happens, and it's something that we've seen in perhaps other card games in the past, but Hearthstone's different, and I'm really glad that Blizzard decided not to implement discarding cards from your opponent's hand as a mechanic in general. But I mean, it's interesting to talk about what could have been. Next up, we have the mechanic of resource destruction, so more specifically destroying your opponent's mana crystals or destroying your opponent's hero power. So anything that destroyed a hero power would definitely have to be like super absurdly costed to not just be like super broken. I mean, like an 8 or 9 mana spell that just like said destroy your opponent's hero power. Although that card might not necessarily be all that good or bad or whatever, it would definitely be pretty unhealthy for the game. I mean, it would completely hose some classes. It would be also a lot worse against other classes as well, and it would be either too just super broken or just way too expensive to be useful. Another possibility would be maybe like a symmetrical effect, like something that destroys both hero powers, but with some of the newer mechanics that have been introduced, that's just too easily abused. Cards like Finley or Riousx that give you a new hero power, or just make cards that destroy both hero powers just super overpowered. Even cards that destroy your own hero power are probably aren't even that bad anymore. But back in the day, if you consider the fact that there weren't any cards that created hero powers, that sort of mechanic is potentially interesting. But Blizzard probably realized pretty early on that hero powers should definitely be a consistent thing, a constant thing that people can rely on, and so any potential cards that might interfere with them just got scrapped from the game. As far as mana crystals go though, destruction of mana crystals potentially almost falls into the same design problem as hero power destruction, honestly. If you make it too cheap, it's just going to be way too strong. If you make it too expensive, it's just going to be completely irrelevant. And at the same time, mechanics like that just aren't really that fun to play with, or play against is probably the better way to say it. Additionally, if you draw those cards too late into the game, they're just flat out useless since the opponent's already going to have a lot of mana. In general, it seems like Blizzard definitely made the right call on not including mechanics that have this sort of like negative effect, or, cards that prevent your opponent from doing things, or focus on like really negatively affecting your opponent rather than actually like doing things in their own right. And it does seem like those kind of mechanics, from the looks of it, they just don't have a place in Hearthstone. Maybe it would be kind of interesting for them to very slowly push that sort of design space, but for the most part, it's something that just got scrapped from Hearthstone completely, and it's very unlikely that we see it in the future. Blizzard's also actually tried a lot of really interesting different mechanics that we just haven't really ever heard about. So one effect that they actually tried early on in the development phases of Hearthstone was a damage over time sort of effect. Something like a poison or like a bleed mechanic that would make the opponent lose a certain amount of life total every turn. This one's definitely very interesting to me because it's something that you'd probably never see in a paper card game, but something that could be very interesting and work fine in a digital card game. But Blizzard actually decided that this mechanic introduced an added level of complexity that they actually didn't really want. And also in their playtesting, they decided that it was fairly an unfun mechanic, honestly, since it ended up being a pretty negative effect for players because you couldn't really interact with the damage, right? You would just take it over time and you'd have to deal with taking damage every turn, which was pretty lame. Another thing we know for sure that Blizzard tried during the early development phases of Hearthstone as far as mechanics go was something that they called combat tricks, which were cards that you could play when an opponent's minion attacked. So kind of like secrets almost, but you wouldn't actually play them until your opponent attacked you. Luckily though, Blizzard ended up making what I believe was a pretty smart decision, and they decided that they just never want people to have the ability to play cards during the opponent's turn. Because the thing is that even just one or a few of these cards being playable makes every single game take way longer to play. If you've ever played a Magic the Gathering video game, or like a Yu-Gi-Oh video game, or like a paper card game as a video game, on your opponent's turn, every time something happens, you have to say whether or not you want to do or respond to the cards that they play, and it makes the game take so much longer. It makes it so that you have to do so much stuff on your opponent's turn. You're constantly clicking, no, I don't want to respond to that. No, I don't have a response. No, I don't want to play this card right now. I'm gonna wait. And it just becomes super, way more complex and just annoying, and all sorts of stuff that just honestly kind of makes the game a lot worse in the digital sense. The idea of combat tricks was changed into secrets, which are definitely a lot better for the game since they had a pretty interesting level of complexity without really taking all that much time either. And it's definitely a very clever and sort of elegant solution to this whole idea of playing cards on your opponent's turn. And I actually really like the design of secrets in general as far as Hearthstone goes, in terms of, being able to do things on your opponent's turn, or have effects on your opponent's turn at least. It's a very clever and elegant way to do it, and I'm actually very happy with how secrets turned out. One thing we also know as far as mechanics go that Blizzard attempted to design was a mechanic called fortresses. So this one's actually really interesting. It's just super wacky and different from what we actually ended up getting. It was kind of like a little bit of a mix between weapons and armor, I guess. Essentially what it did was that it would let your hero equip or sort of go into this fortress that would have around 20 HP or so. And so the opponent then had to destroy the fortress in order to be able to attack your hero. So while we don't know what classes had this mechanic, or what classes it was going to belong to. It probably would have potentially belonged to all of them, or maybe it was just something that was like a legendary or something like that. We don't know entirely for sure about some of the other details about how it worked. It does sound like a really just super strange and wacky mechanic, potentially something that might have invaded the Warriors design space a little bit, but it's interesting to see that they tested out something that was just so far out there and ridiculous, honestly. And it did seem like they were messing around and sort of, trying to play test a lot more like defensive options for cards and just design in general, but they pretty much just ended up getting scrapped in the very early stages of the game. It does seem like fortresses probably sound a lot more complex than something that the developers would want to actually exist in Hearthstone. So of course, as we all know, it didn't end up making it into the game. So those are definitely some of the pretty, more interesting designs and mechanics that Blizzard explored for early versions of Hearthstone. I'm definitely interested in knowing, what kind of mechanics do you guys want to see make it into the game? Or maybe what mechanics do you wish made it into the game that ended up getting canceled? Definitely let us know in the comments section below. Either way, looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.